Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. The next witness is Mr. Rohit Rajar. He will also be assisted with some of the documentation by Selen Kwane, who's next to him, and he's ready to be sworn in.
Do you have any objections to taking the oath?
No.
If not, do you swear that the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Can I again ask also to be seated during
Yes,
the
indeed.
questioning? Thank you. Mr. Raja, you have also informed me that is your first time
Yes.
where you testify before a commission of inquiry, or for that matter in any court of law. You are English speaking. You're comfortable to testify in English?
Yes.
Thank you. Can you start off by telling the commission who you are, when were you employed by the PIC, and what exact portfolio you are handling at the PIC?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner and members. My name is Rohit Rajar. I was employed by the PIC on 1 October 2009 and have been in its employ since then with uninterrupted service, holding various titles entailing responsibilities aligned to those roles. I am currently employed as the Executive Head of Impact Investing and report directly to the Chief Executive Officer of the PIC. My qualifications are a Bachelor in Accounting Science, a postgraduate diploma in accounting, which is the Certificate of Theory in Accounting, higher diploma in tax law, and certificate in advanced company law. I qualified as a chartered accountant in 1991. I'm going to provide, I've been requested to provide information on the investment process insofar as it relates to unlisted investments. But prior to that, I'd just like to give a background before I start in the process. The unlisted investment portfolio whose process I'm going to describe in here consists of 3 divisions: the private equity division, the impact investing division, and unlisted properties division. I understand that the unlisted properties division will submit a separate statement confirming the investment process related to it. Therefore, this statement relates to the investment process insofar as it relates to private equity and impact investing.
Can you, before you proceed, just elaborate on exactly what is meant by private equity and impact investing, and what is understood by unlisted properties?
Okay, so the essential distinction is in private equity, predominantly you are dealing with transactions where there is an exchange of shareholding from one person to another. So it usually does not involve a financial impact on the company, but rather just a change in shareholding. On the impact investing side, it will deal predominantly with startup investments or expansions, so where the funds will flow into the company. So it is going to impact on the financial position of the company. Now, unlisted properties would deal with investment in properties, which the executive head of properties will deal with later on in this week, but it will comprise investments in, for example, the retail properties, office. You could have specialized properties as well. So that would be typically what would fall in unlisted properties division.
Thank you. There's a question.
two questions. Do you have a separate head of private equity and impact investing, or are you the overall head of those divisions? And second one, just come again on the private equity side. Just explain it again, please.
So there are heads, there's a separate executive head for private equity. There's a separate executive head for impact investing. But however, in terms of process, they follow the identical process. They go to the same committees, everything is identical, hence it's being dealt with as one.
And you are the head of those two areas?
No, I am the head of impact investing. I have another colleague who's the head of private equity.
Okay.
So on equity, you'd have a transaction for, as an example, you'll have a BE transaction where a BE party wants to buy into the ownership of the company. So it'll just be a sale of shares between the one party to the other. It wouldn't have an impact. But that's predominantly what it is. But of course, you could have a situation where monies enter the company where, let's say, for example, a fresh issue of shares is done by the company to which a BE party subscribes. That would happen, but predominantly it's the exchange of shares.
I get you. All right, good.
So in terms of some context to private equity directors, one of which is chairperson, the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer. I need to point out that these committees reflect the current status and the composition thereof has changed over a number of years. There are circumstances where proposals or investment proposals will be referred to the PIC board, the Social and Ethics Committee, and or the client. There are various instruments in place which provide a framework for undertaking unlisted investments. These include the client mandate, policies, processes, guidelines, delegation of authority, and governance structures. In terms of the investment process, below is a description of the investment process as it relates to private equity and impact investing divisions of PIC. It will make reference to certain committees in certain instances below. It is suggested that the investment process be read in conjunction with the terms of reference of the relevant committees of PIC, as well as the delegation of authority insofar as it relates to unlisted investments. It must be highlighted that this process has been tabled at different instruments of government, such as the Standing Committee on Finance, the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, the Public Protector, the Auditor General of South Africa. It may have taken different forms, such as in the form of a PowerPoint presentation, a full text document like this one.
Is what you're saying, with your leave, Mr. Commissioner, that this whole process has been presented to the Standing Committee of Finance, etc., and Auditor General, etc., and met with their approval?
Yes, it has met with their approval. So if we start with, now if we take a particular transaction, so you have an applicant. So the PIC will receive applications for finance through various means, which could include the following: unsolicited applications from clients or their advisors. These would come to PIC to the extent that it lands on the desk of divisions other than the private equity and impact investing divisions. It will be referred to the private equity and impact investing division. It could be through deal origination directly by PIC investment professionals. It could be referrals by other funding institutions. Deals could come from strategic partners with whom PIC has concluded memorandums of understandings, such as the Industrial Development Corporation and the Developmental Bank of Southern Africa. On occasions, certain investments are delisted in which case they come into the unlisted investment portfolio. Upon receipt of the application by the respective team, an application acknowledgement letter will be prepared and sent to the potential client.
Excuse me for interrupting again, Mr. Commissioner. Can you just explain to the Commission the ratio of these deals coming to the PIC? Is it correct that unsolicited applications are the majority of applications coming to the PIC, as I can call it, walk-in clients?
Yes, that's true. It's by far the most number of proposals. An initial desktop review of the application is conducted by the investment team. It is tested primarily to ascertain compliance with PIC investment mandate, particularly in relation to meeting financial returns and the level of developmental impact, such as job creation, housing provision, and education, as well as the nature of the project. If the application fails to meet the mandate, it is declined and the applicant is informed accordingly. If the application, based on a desktop evaluation, meets the mandate requirements, the investment team will prepare a deal screening report for submission to the executive head for review and an approval to submit to the deal screening task team, which is a structure within the asset allocation committee, which I referred to earlier.
Can I, again, sorry to interrupt again, this deal screening task team, I believe, is quite a new procedure that has been brought into the PIC.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, that is true. It's a process. Our investment process evolves over time, and we try to improve where necessary. So this particular task team has been introduced in this latest financial year. So once approval by
Just give us a moment.
In the mandate, section 24 or paragraph 24, if application meets the mandate, I just wanted to know, how do you let people know what your mandate is? You know, like if people bring transactions, how would they know beforehand whether it meets your mandate, you know, or not? Do you communicate that, or they have to find out when they come see you?
Thank you. That is communicated via the website, where we'll state under the different subdivisions of the within the impact investing division and the private equity division, it'll spell out the criteria in there. So once once approved by the executive head, the deal screening report will be submitted to the deal screening task team via the company secretariat of the PIC. At this point in time, I'd just like to bring to the Commission's awareness that whichever committees I've referred to previously, submissions are always done via the company secretariat of the PIC. Then at the deal screening stage, the investment team will make a presentation to the deal screening task team, requesting approval to submit a scoping report to the Portfolio Management Committee of Unlisted Investments. The purpose of this scoping report is to obtain approval to proceed to due diligence and, where necessary, incur costs in appointing consultants to assist in certain parts of the due diligence. The deal screening task team will consider the submission and either approve, decline, or refer the submission back to the investment team for further work. If the submission by the investment team is declined, a decline letter with reasons will be prepared by the investment team and signed in line with the delegation of authority as it applies to assets under management, and accordingly sent to the applicant. If the submission is approved, the investment team, in consultation with other relevant PIC divisions, prepare the scoping report for submission to the Portfolio Management Committee of Unlisted Investments. Staff assigned to work on the transaction will be required to indicate whether any of them has a conflict of interest by completing a document entitled a Declaration of Conflict of Interest form. Then the transaction would move to deal scoping. The investment team will prepare with inputs from other PIC divisions the scoping report requesting approval to proceed to due diligence. The scoping report is submitted to the executive head for review and approval to submit to the Portfolio Management Committee of Unlisted Investments. This committee will consider the submission and either approve or decline or request to go to due diligence or refer the submission back to the investment team for rework. If declined, the investment team will prepare a decline letter to be signed in accordance with the delegation of authority. If referred for rework, the investment team will revise its initial submission and resubmit an amended document to the Portfolio Management Committee of Unlisted Investments. If approved, the application will move to the due diligence stage. Upon receiving approval to proceed to the due diligence stage, the investment team will request from the various executive heads of the risk division, legal division, and ESG divisions, which may environmental, social, and governance, for resources to assist in the due diligence of the proposed transaction. The investment team will prepare an engagement letter and an indicative term sheet, which is reviewed by the legal team before forwarding it to the potential client for review and sign off in line with the delegation of authority. The engagement letter will include, inter alia, the scope of the due diligence to be covered by the various investment teams and information required for Know Your Client and FICA procedures. At due diligence stage, depending on whether the investment team or the ESG team or legal and risk teams has internal capacity to conduct due diligence on the transaction, a decision will be made by the respective teams as to which section of the due diligence scope will be outsourced to third-party advisors and which section will be done using internal resources. If the decision is to outsource, procurement process will be undertaken to appoint the relevant service providers to conduct due diligence on the transaction on behalf of the respective teams as per the unlisted investment procurement policy and process.
Sorry to interrupt again. Do I understand correctly, at this stage then, the normal supply chain management will apply in terms of the PFMA?
Through your chair, that's correct. The respective investment...
Sorry, tell me, when due diligence is done, what is actually done? What is being checked?
Chair, can I come to that later? The respective investment teams or the investment management operations team will prepare a request for proposal which will include the scope of the due diligence and furthermore agree on which service providers to be approached from the approved service provider database. The process will be done in conjunction with the respective investment teams. If there are no sufficient and/or experienced service providers on the approved database, a request for approval to approach service providers outside the database will be prepared, and such request will be approved in line with the delegation of authority. Once the request for proposal is completed and the required number of service providers have been agreed upon, the request for proposal will be issued by the investment management operations team to the selected service providers. The request for proposal will be accompanied by declarations of interest and non-disclosure agreements. Depending on the requirements of the request for proposals, service providers will submit proposals in electronic form and/or hard copies to the investment management operations team within the requirement timelines as stated in the request for proposal. Once received, the investment management operations team will convene an evaluation task team which will include a representative from the PIC supply chain unit. The proposals will be evaluated in line with the assets under management procurement policy, and the service provider with the highest score will be recommended for appointment. The approval of a service provider will be done in line with the delegation of authority. Once the approval is obtained, an engagement letter will be concluded between PIC and the service provider. The engagement letter must be reviewed by a legal division and signed in line with the delegation of authority.
There's a question for you.
Yeah, just a question on, one would think that you would probably have a approved supplier list, you know, to do the due diligence. I mean, do you have that, or do you have to go through this thing all, you know, all the time?
Thank you, Mr. Lediga. Yes, we have a database of service providers where the different area of expertise is captured, things like the capacity and so forth. We allow that database to be completed continuously, but every 3 years, I think we have put out in the print media a request for service providers as well. Once an engagement letter is signed, a kickoff meeting is scheduled and held with the appointed service provider for a briefing on the proposed transaction and the scope of the due diligence. Once the appointed service provider has completed the scope of work as outlined in the request for proposal, the service provider will prepare a due diligence report for submission to the relevant investment team. The investment team will engage with the service provider until the final report is submitted. So whilst that work is being conducted, there is continuous engagement so that we ensure the entire scope of responsibilities is discharged. Once the kickoff meeting is done, the investment team will share all information received from the potential client as per the due diligence checklist with the approved service provider. After this, there is a site visit and meetings are held with the potential client. Now, insofar as the due diligence is concerned, the scope of the due diligence will cover typically it will cover a commercial due diligence, a financial due diligence, a technical and operational due diligence, a legal and regulatory due diligence, and an environmental, social, and governance due diligence. So that is the scope of the due diligence that will be undertaken. From the outcome of the due diligence, the transaction structure will be agreed, that meaning how much is allocated between debt, equity, or quasi-equity type instruments. And the risk division will conclude an independent risk review assessment on each of the due diligence areas that I have referred to above. So the risk unit does a credit risk report independent of the investment team.
I'm sorry again to interrupt. Can I take you back to 43? When you say a commercial due diligence, can you just elaborate on that? What is meant by that?
So commercial due diligence would typically include an assessment of the industry, the sector in which it's operating, the subsector, the competitive advantage of the company in those markets, dealing mainly with the market aspects of the transaction.
The financial due diligence?
So the financial due diligence would cover an assessment of the financial performance of the company, the financial condition of the company.
Financial statements?
Yeah, the financial statements, the cash flow information. It'll cover valuations, as well as including looking at the assumptions that drive projections that have been submitted.
And then lastly, technical and operational due diligence. Does that look at the structure of the company, whether there are policies and procedures in place, etc.?
Yes, that would be covered under the operational due diligence. Technical will relate mainly to, if we're dealing with a manufacturing type of company,
Yes.
then you're looking more from the engineering side,
Yes.
the plant and so forth.
Thank you.
Then we would move over to the deal approval stage, where the investment team will prepare an appraisal report for submission to the Portfolio Management Committee of Unlisted Investments. The appraisal report will be reviewed and signed off by the executive head of the relevant investment division prior to submission to the Portfolio Management Committee of Unlisted Investments. Essentially, the appraisal report is the investment recommendation by the investment team based on the findings of the due diligence. The appraisal report will be accompanied by independent reports from the environmental, social and governance team, the risk team and the legal divisions, and these reports will incorporate the due diligence findings and the controls to be implemented to mitigate any risks identified during the respective due diligence investigations.
Can I again, sorry to interrupt again, I think it is important to emphasize that apart from the appraisal report, there are independent reports, totally independent from the due diligence regarding ESG, risk and legal.
Yes, that's true.
And just to mention an example, if there is a negative report by legal or by risk, what will happen? What is the impact?
Okay, so prior to the issuance of the report, there will be deliberations between the investment team and the other teams, where they will try to reach consensus, but if not, each team will submit their report independently. That will have to go to the committee, and the committee, based on all information available to it, will make a decision. So even if there's a conflicting report between, let's say, for example, the risk division and the investment team, that will be tabled as is to the relevant approving committee. The Portfolio Management Committee of Unlisted Investments will consider the submission and either approve or decline or refer the submission back to the investment team for rework. If the submission is declined by the Portfolio Management Committee of Unlisted Investments, the investment team will prepare a decline letter to be signed in line with the delegation of authority and submitted to the client. If it does not fall within the PMC or the Portfolio Management Committee of Unlisted Investments delegation of authority, the transaction will be referred for onward submission to the relevant governance committee as per the delegation of authority for consideration. The relevant committee would typically be the investment committee or its subcommittees, namely the fund investment panel. So at this stage here, you would have, for example, the Portfolio Management Committee would have a 200 million rand delegation of authority where it can approve in terms of, let's say, transactions that are not in the infrastructure space, but let's say it is more than that, then it has to go to a higher committee. If the proposed transaction falls within the Portfolio Management Committee delegation of authority and is approved by the Portfolio Management Unlisted Investments, the investment team will accordingly prepare an approval letter which will be signed in line with the delegation of authority and submitted to the potential client. The company secretary will prepare a resolution which is signed by the approving committee chairperson. If referred back to for rework, the investment team will rework and resubmit to the Portfolio Management Committee. After the Portfolio Management Committee recommends the proposed transaction to a higher committee for approval, the same reports modified to the extent necessary based on comments from the Portfolio Management Committee are signed by PIC's Chief Executive Officer and submitted via Company Secretariat to the investment committee or relevant fund investment panel. Those committees will consider the submission and either approve or decline or refer submission back to the investment team for rework. Again, if declined, the investment team will prepare a decline letter to be signed in line with the delegation of authority and sent to the client. If referred for rework, the investment team will rework and resubmit the submissions to the investment committee or fund investment panel for further consideration. If approved,
Another question.
Just to check one or two things. Once a transaction has gone through a due diligence stage, are there times when you decline it or you revise it? And if that has happened, what could be those areas where you say we're declining or we are revising this transaction?
yes, through you, Mr. Commissioner, throughout the process at any point in time, the transaction can be declined if, let's say at the initial stage, if new information comes to light that adversely affects our view on the transaction, we can decline it. Following due diligence, we may also decline a transaction because we would have done a desktop review and limited due diligence, but we have to still validate the information that the client represented to us. And if we find that it's a material misrepresentation that affects the viability of the project, or material misrepresentation would cast doubt on the credibility of the client, then we may decline the transaction.
Can I just ask, maybe I should be closer. Can I just ask the time between, the walk-in client has come in and made a proposal to, because you seem to be going through committees and due diligence and so on. How long does it take to get the final response?
It's a difficult question, but typically it would not take less than 3 months. Typically it would not take less than 3 months. But that also, one must bear in mind that very rarely will you get a client who comes to you, provides you with all the information you require. So there's a lot of to and fro that goes on. But once you reach the point of going through the scoping phase, it means that at that point in time, we've basically got most of the information. So between that time and approval, it wouldn't take that long. But a lot of time is taken, if we take the entire project phase, a lot of time will be taken bringing it to a point where we have all the information. And if we take a transaction which reaches a disbursement, a lot of that time would be taken on the legal process, because typically there's a lot of negotiation happening, and then we will always have certain conditions that have to be fulfilled prior to us disbursing, some of which is outside the control of both ourselves and the client, because, for example, if we're going to deal with matters that require approval by the competition authorities, that takes its own time. We are not in control of that. So that's what can make a proposal long drawn out.
Sorry, another question.
Is there a minimum size of support of the company that you are looking at, or the request for support? Is there a minimum size that because you've got a separate one for SMMEs, is there a minimum size that you look at?
Yes, through your chair, we have a minimum size. It's 50 million rand. However, that I just want to draw attention to the fact that we want to reach clients that require funding that is significantly lower than that. But in that regard, what we would do is that we would provide a facility to an intermediary who specializes in that particular area. So for example, some years ago we had provided a 400 million rand facility to business partners to on-lend to entrepreneurs seeking funding anywhere from 150,000 rand to 5 million rand. So there we'd like to use a partner to reach those clients. So if once the transaction has been approved, it will move to the negotiation and drafting of legal agreements process. Once approval is obtained from the relevant governance committee, the legal division will commence with the drafting of the agreements with inputs from other teams within PIC. The drafting of legal agreements can be either outsourced or drafted using internal resources. If outsourced, the legal team will appoint a law firm following the same procurement process outlined above with regards to due diligence. The legal agreements will be drafted in line with the terms and conditions of the approving committee.
Can I take it that for legal firms there's also a database?
Yes, for legal firms there is a database which is periodically reviewed as well. Once drafted, the legal agreements will be signed by the client and the CEO of the PIC or his delegate, and the transaction will move to the disbursement process. Once both parties have signed the legal agreements, the respective transaction teams led by the investment team, legal team, risk team, and ESG team, they will oversee the fulfillment of all the conditions precedent, both of a legal and non-legal nature, including conditions for disbursement. The legal team will prepare and issue a legal conditions precedent satisfaction letter to the client confirming that all conditions precedent have been met and that the agreements are now unconditional. The condition precedent satisfaction letter will be signed in line with the delegation of authority. The legal and investment team will complete and sign off the checklist. Once all the conditions precedent have been met, the transaction will move to the handover process led by the investment management operations team. So once the condition precedents have been met, a handover meeting will be convened by the investment management operations team and all relevant stakeholders. So that is other divisions within the PIC will be invited to a handover meeting. The purpose of the meeting is to appraise all the relevant PIC divisions about the transaction. The investment team will make a presentation focusing on the key aspects of the transaction. The investment team presents the details of the transaction to the appropriate PIC divisions to ensure a common understanding. Attendance register will be circulated and signed by all in attendance and shall be filed in the disbursement file. Once the handover process is completed, the transaction will move to a disbursement process.
Again, sorry to interrupt, and the Commissioner already asked you this. It seems to me to be an extremely elaborate process. In general, what is the average time frame for a normal transaction to be completed before we start with the disbursement process?
Mr. Commissioner, it would typically be between 3 months and 6 months, though it could take longer than that. If I may explain, for example, I think if we take renewable energy projects, which typically are very large projects, so in those type of situations, PIC normally would not take 100% position in the project. We'd work with other funders. So that also has an impact in terms of the timelines, because you're dealing with other financiers and there's a lot of negotiation that goes on. So that can go up even up to a year.
Would you say that in a transaction of 3 to 6 months, the latter part, say the 3 months, would be more about legal agreements? Would you say that?
Yes, that's true. It would be more in terms of the legal agreements meeting the conditions, which may include approval of the transaction by regulatory authorities.
Other questions?
Yeah, what would you regard as a success rate if you had to evaluate a project that you have approved and invested in? And what is your rough percentage of success, and what would you do in the event that you have approved something and it doesn't work out? Is that just written off? What measures do you take in terms of assessing your own assessments or the issues that you perhaps might not have anticipated? What is your evaluation process?
Okay. I think I can provide the figures afterwards in terms of the actual performance. But if we take inevitably in investing in this space, transactions will go wrong. So what happens in those instances is that we will constitute what we call a workout team. So it'll incorporate members from different teams, as well as with support from an external service provider who can assist in turnaround, and then we'll develop a strategy and a plan to turn around the company. Now, failing that, if we reach the point where we think that there's no realistic prospect of turning around the company, then we'd have to take courses of action to recoup as much as we can from a liquidation process. So if we move to the disbursement process, post the handover meeting, the investment team, assisted by the investment management operations team, will prepare the disbursement file. The disbursement file will be prepared in line with the disbursement checklist referred to above. Accompanying the disbursement file would be a disbursement memorandum requesting approval to disburse funds. The disbursement memorandum will be signed in line with the delegation of authority. Once approved, the memorandum and the disbursement file will be submitted to investment finance for payment of the funds in line with the memorandum. Once payment is made, the investment finance team will forward proof of payment to the investment management operations team for filing in the disbursement file. Once disbursed, the transaction will move to the post-investment monitoring and valuation unit. Now, I'd just like to point out that the team responsible for conducting or doing the investment, making the investment, is separate from a team that we call the post-investment management team, which will actually monitor the transaction to see that it meets all the conditions, it's performing in line with what the base case that was submitted to the committee. So that's also for good control. So there's an independent team overlooking the deal that was tabled by the investment team.
Two questions from there. Post-investment monitoring. Do you have a framework that you guys use, or you mainly put people on the board of those companies and they can decide how they will monitor that? And how does that monitoring cascade into the PIC? Just as a first question. The second question is, when an investment is not doing well, has there been a time when you have, for lack of a better word, pulled the plug on investments, asking back for the debt you have provided, or a liquidation, or other things?
Okay, thank you. Through you, Mr. Commissioner. On the post-investment side, sorry, if you can please.
post-investment monitoring, do you have a framework for that, or you just let people who are on those boards decide how they will monitor these companies?
Okay, yes, we do have a framework for the monitoring of the investment. At the same time, we do appoint people to the board, but we realize that in terms of the strict legal implication of it is that the director has a duty to the board, to the company. That's his fiduciary responsibility. It is not to us as the PIC. So, in addition to that, we'll have a post-investment management team that will do the work. So we're not relying on the person onto the board, because there may be instances where that member cannot provide information to the PIC. So we recognize that limitation. With regards to transactions that have gone under, yes, we have been involved in transactions where we have had to put it under liquidation. We've been involved in that. We've been involved in transactions where we had to be part of a business rescue process as well.
Just as a matter of interest, because I've done those before. Business rescue, have you had instances where it has succeeded? If you had any.
Look, on business rescue, we have projects at the moment in that it's too early to say whether it's successful, but what I can say is that companies that have gone into distress, which were not put into business rescue, but where we had intervened on our own, we have several instances of that where it has been turned around. Then if we move to
Sorry, Commissioner, can I just come in here? It's important to understand this post-investment monitoring and valuation. Is it done internally or is it outsourced?
Through you, Mr. Commissioner, the post-investment monitoring is done internally. Where, however, we move the project into a workout situation, it will inevitably involve internal people as well as an external service provider. Then if we deal with the valuations part, which was raised by Mr. Lydia early on, and I think Ms. Louw indicated more the annual valuation process, but I think you also asked in terms of valuations prior to making the investments. So I just want to clarify on that, where it is valuations prior to making the investment, that would usually be done by both the internal team as well as appointing an external service provider to assist in the valuation. However, just to clarify that where that instance arises, the same firm cannot value the investment at the end of the year. It has to be a different firm doing the valuation. Then there may be instances where there's repeat funding. So a client who we had funded before would come back for more funding. It will follow the same identical investment process. However, due regard is taken at this point in time to the cumulative amount. So, for example, if the PMC had a 200 million rand limit and they approved an investment, say, of 150 million rand, and somebody now is coming for another 100 million, it won't be approved at that committee. It will go to the next committee, because on a cumulative basis, it exceeds the delegation of authority of the portfolio management committee. So that's to avoid a situation where transactions are split in half so that it falls below the threshold.
Okay, a question. This is not linked to this point now, but it's a question of limits. Do you have limits for people bringing transactions, like saying you can bring no more than 3 or 4 transactions, or we can't spend, say, 10 billion on one person or one promoter? Do you have limits for those kind of things?
Okay, through you, Mr. Commissioner. Yes, we do. So, if we let's take our biggest client, Government Employees Pension Fund. So there we have what we call private placement memorandums for different sectors. So we'll have one for energy, one for social infrastructure, and so forth. Within those private placement memorandums, there will be limits in terms of how much may be invested in any single counterparty. It goes beyond that. It will also deal with how much can be invested in a certain sector, for example. So those limits are in place. However, having said that, we think that there is also room to improve in terms of getting more granular.
Yeah, just to be clear, so I wanted to check if there are limits on specific companies or individuals who are promoting transactions to the PIC. Do you have limits for those?
Yes, so for example, if we take, again on the GPF, it's limited to 30% of the committed capital. So let's say we have a private placement memorandum allocation of 10 billion. So it's limited to 3 billion, but a person can do, we don't have a limit in terms of the number of transactions, but in aggregate, it must not exceed 3 billion. Having said that, in terms of the number of transactions, that we would have to consider during the due diligence process, that what is the capacity of this institute, this group, to have multiple projects, because they could spread themselves too thin. We usually will have undertakings with them of what we expect their role to be in the company and what to deliver. So we have to assess their capacity to do that. So there are instances where we have not approved transactions because we felt that the capacity, they are stretching themselves too thin.
Meaning you don't have hard limits, you got soft limits. One would say that, because you would look at transaction by transaction and say this grouping cannot take more than 3 transactions. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, the only hard limit is the 30%. So if we got an allocation of 10 billion in a particular fund, it can't be more than 3 billion. They cannot exceed the 3 billion rand limit in aggregate.
And just to clarify the matter further, where there's a follow-on or for repeat funding, say for instance there was an application for 100 million, and then there's another application for another million, that will go exactly through the same process as for the first application.
Yes, that's true. And in it,
Can I just try and understand that? Because I understand the process that you're raising. If a company X says we need R1 billion, and you do all of that, and then they come back for another billion, doesn't that raise a question as to why would you have not envisaged in your first approach that it is not R1 billion and you need, it's actually 2 billion, because otherwise you could be going through the process and agreeing a second billion because it sounds fine, but in actual fact there's a flaw in the thinking, because the first billion should have anticipated it wasn't in R1 billion amount. So either it made a mistake on the first, or it is a growth beyond expectation, in which event it falls into a different kind of category. I mean, I would be a little bit concerned, or I would just ask, is it correct that you just do the same process for a second billion as you did for the first if you didn't anticipate the second billion?
yes, what would have, I'll give you circumstances where that may arise is where, for example, we would want to see a transaction that is a scalable one. So sometimes somebody might come with a request for the 2 billion. We're not comfortable to give them the 2 billion. We rather say, we'll give you $1 billion, let's see how you perform, and then we will consider a further amount. We also have to take into account, particularly where we're dealing with startup or early stage investments, is that rapid growth can also kill the business. So it will be in situations like that. You could have another situation where, again, when you're dealing with startup, your risk of estimation or misestimation is a bit wider because you're trying your best to project what the needs of the company is, and more often than not, in a startup, you'll underestimate its needs, then in which case we have to come to recapitalization. But it's, I can't think of an instance where we should have known that it was true, but we did one. I just can't think of one at the moment. So then if we move to the stage of exit, because sometimes in making these investments, particularly in the unlisted space, we would contract to exit at some point. Then here the portfolio management and valuations team and the investment team shall facilitate an exit, and jointly they shall prepare submission to the appropriate governance committees in line with the delegation of authority for approval for exit.
Sorry to interrupt again. That PMV committee, that's the committee Mrs. Louw referred to in her evidence.
Through your chair, I think the committee she referred was a finance valuations committee. That was a different committee. So investment exits are governed according to the investment thesis as approved by the relevant governance committee at the time of initial approval and undertaken in line with PIC's asset disposal guidelines and legal agreements. I think in Mrs. Louw's statement, she referred to the asset disposal guidelines, so it sets out the rules and guidelines under which disposals can be done. Now, the investment process, which I've outlined above, represents the current investment process, which has evolved over a period of time as a result of continual improvements and enhancements over a number of years. I just want to give the committee some examples of where the changes have occurred. So maybe perhaps if we say from about 2013 and before that, we had a lot of the approvals were either done at the equivalent of what is called a portfolio management committee. It was then called Exco Investment. And then the rest of the investments were done by the investment committee. Subsequent to that, we realized that the areas in which we had to be involved in funding are so specialized that we had to create subcommittees under the investment committee. So for example, one that deals with infrastructure, one that deals with property, and one that deals with the rest. So then we established the fund investment panel. Where at that point we had independent industry experts to sit on those panels. Later on, those independent experts became full members of the PIC board. Then in terms of politically exposed persons, we've also improved in terms of the policy in that regard. What do we do? Then following the establishment of the Social and Ethics Committee, what we have done is at any stage of that process, the Social and Ethics Committee can be approached for guidance to the committee to which the project is serving. Notwithstanding that at committees we have declaration of interest registers signed. Later on we decided let's bring a process of declaration much earlier in the process. So that's something else that we had brought in. We've incorporating ESG issues in the investment process as well. So those are some of the things, and even going forward, there may be areas where we find that we can improve, and that's what we continually strive to do. Thank you.
Can you, before you conclude, just tell us a bit more? What is your understanding of a politically exposed person?
Well, our understanding of a politically exposed person is any person who has been employed in any sphere of government, including public entities. Then it's people related to those persons. I think it's within 2 degrees of consanguinity. So that's our understanding. And then it's also people who is known to be politically aligned. I mean, based on reports that you see in the public. So we'd also consider them to be politically exposed persons.
Mr. Commissioner, that is the evidence, but I mean, there's still
There's a question.
questions.
If you can, just a few stats about your division, you know, where you are. Like in terms of how many transactions do you typically do per annum? What is your decline rate? And coming to Jill's question on the success rate, is there a way you could give us that over time our success rate is a certain percentage and all?
Yes, so the decline, so, and yeah, I'm going to take all applications that we received. So you would find that typically you're going to have more than, I would say, 90% would be declined, right? So in terms of the number of transactions we would do in a year, I think between the private equity and impact investing division, I think it'll be between 10 and 20 transactions in a year that we would conclude.
Success rate, roughly
Okay.
over time?
I think if we say, let's define it in terms of maybe what is the impairment rate. I don't have the figures, but I know it will be definitely below 10%. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. The planning was to deal with these 2 witnesses today, but there was the expectation that we might take longer or that we finish earlier. I don't know till what time you plan to sit, but according to Plan B, I have a witness available that I expect will not take longer than half an hour. The statement is prepared and ready, and if you're ready to proceed with that, I would just ask for a 5-minute adjournment to arrange things.
When would you be able to give us copies of the statement?
Immediately.
Immediately. Right. Then we feel that we should hear that witness
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
and make use of the time that's available. Okay. How long would you want to adjourn?
5 minutes is fine.
5 minutes. Right. The Commissioner will adjourn then for 5 minutes.
Will you take it to the judge? Everything, thanks. No, well done. Shelter. Have you got a copy of your statement? Have you got a copy of your statement? Here it is. Let's go to my board and just quickly check.
toch over impairment.
two, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. Sounds quite the same.
Okay. 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Commissioner. I just quickly want to recall Mr. Raja. I forgot to put a very important question to him. If you can just please remind him that he is still under oath.
Mr. Raja, you're still under oath? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Mr. Raja, in terms of the Commission's terms of reference, the Commission must inquire into whether any alleged impropriety regarding investment decisions by the PIC in the media reports in 2017 and 18 contravened any legislation, PIC policy, or contractual obligations, or whether any PIC director or employee used his or her position or privileges or confidential information for personal gain or to improperly benefit another person. In your position at the PIC, are you aware of any such impropriety?
Mr. Commissioner, no, I'm not aware of any such impropriety.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. That concludes his evidence. My next witness is Mr. Dolamu. He's already present and ready to testify. I trust you have received his statement. He is ready to take the oath in.
Mr. Dolamo, do you have any objection to taking the oath?
No, sir.
Do you then swear that the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Raise your right hand and say, so help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you.
Mr. Dolamu, is this also your first time testifying before a commission or in a court of law?
That's correct, sir.
Can you tell the commission who you are and what your qualifications are?
My name is Sholto Mokwaji Dolamo. I have the following qualifications: Bachelor of Science in Chemistry, a Bachelor of Technology in Ceramic Science, Master of Science in Engineering, as well as a Master of Business Administration or an MBA.
Thank you. When did you join the PIC?
I joined the PIC on the 1st of October 2014, initially as a portfolio manager within the listed investments division. On the 1st of September 2015, I was appointed as Executive Head of Research and Project Development, which at the time was a newly formed division. On or around July 2017, I further took on executive responsibility for Fund of Funds. I report directly to the Chief Executive Officer of the PIC.
All right, we will come back to your responsibility for funds of funds later in your testimony. You have read, I understand, the statement by the previous witness, Mr. Raja, and you were also present this afternoon in this building when he testified.
That's correct, sir.
Can you confirm under oath that what he stated regarding the policies, procedures, and processes regarding unlisted investments are correct?
That's correct, sir. They are correct.
Now, can you just then elaborate on the differences between the investments he's chairing and other investments? Because you are also involved in the strategic objective of the Research and Project Development Division. Yeah. And you also chair, I believe, the screening committee.
That's correct, sir.
Please proceed then.
So the division that I am responsible for, or part of the division that I'm responsible for is research, and its strategic objective really is to provide the PIC with quality and relevant research that allows for informed investments to be established in order to further enhance the client's returns, as well as simultaneously looking at ways at how that could stimulate economic growth in line with the National Development Plan and other relevant government support growth plans. What we also do is continuously scan and research evolving global and local structural macroeconomic as well as sectoral themes to better inform the PIC's clients' portfolios so that we are well positioned for the long term. This includes the following: determining how the PIC should be tactically positioned from an asset allocation perspective, establishing medium and long-term investable themes and ideas that will ensure that long-term returns are sustainable and are well generated, to develop sector investment strategies and investment projects within the identified sectors to optimize returns. Furthermore, to generate new knowledge and investable ideas to enable the PIC to achieve financial return objectives and developmental impact in the following sectors: mining and beneficiation, energy, both renewable and conventional energy, manufacturing, agriculture and agro-processing, financial services, information, communication and technology, infrastructure, including real estate or property, social infrastructure, that will include healthcare as well as education and tourism. Furthermore, we provide the institution with sectoral research and insight across various regions of the African continent to inform where we should be investing.
Question.
There's a question.
Yeah. On 2.3, you are saying to generate new knowledge. So one assumes this would be not run-of-the-mill, sort of investments. This would be different kind of thing. Maybe can you explain that when you say new knowledge and investable, ideas?
So by yes, through you, Justice. New investable ideas would be literally where we should be investing in the longer term, and that would be areas where perhaps there's very little or very little knowledge about how to generate investable ideas out of that. To give you an example, recently we developed ideas around how to invest in areas for new demand of PGM metals, right? And we developed an investment vehicle that we could invest in alongside other partners, to further enhance client returns from in the PGM space.
All right.
So
investments.
So this is new investment ideas.
Yeah.
Is what I'm talking to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it will be new knowledge, for example, on how we should be better positioned within a particular sector. Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Mr. Commissioner, for my own information, I would like to learn more about PGM.
So PGMs are platinum group metals. As you would know, South Africa is one of the largest producers of platinum group metals. We're largely a supplier into the rest of the world in as far as platinum group metals are concerned. So speaking specifically to this particular idea was, how do we not only invest in supply, because as a PIC we are quite a significant shareholder in platinum mining companies. So the idea was then, how do we not only participate in supply, but also try and stimulate demand, and therefore try and find investable ideas in the demand space that we could position ourselves in. So that's basically what would constitute a new way of doing things, specifically within the South African space.
It seems that you are chairing a very important portfolio of the PIC, and I'm sure that all this research and new ideas cannot be coming from you alone. Can you tell us, the Commission, more about your team, who they are, what do they consist of?
So I have a team of over 10 investment professionals. Most of them are from the private sector, from economists to engineers to people with MBAs and CFAs, we have even we call him a rocket scientist, but he did astrophysics at university. So we have a myriad of skill sets within the research space.
In the age of artificial intelligence, do you employ any robots?
Not yet.
Please carry on.
Yeah, just another question. So this would also include the venture capital? Would this include that?
No. So within the fund of funds team, right? We invested in funds, and I'll talk to fund of funds later on. But as I said, my title is research and project development. So within project development, which you could potentially also classify as venture capital, we are looking at early stage type of funds or investments. We haven't as yet allocated in that space yet, but there's a space that we'll be looking at in the future.
Please proceed. Paragraph 3.
So on paragraph 3, so how the research and project development division relates to investment process through macroeconomic sector, market or company fundamental in-house research. The research team provides support to private equity as well as impact investing throughout the investment process from deal screening up until deal approval. We also provide macroeconomic and sector research to the listed investment division. Furthermore, as a consequence of the sectoral and thematic research, the research division also originates deals in line with the sector strategies that we have developed. As the head of research, I am a member of the following committees: Asset Allocation Committee, which I chair, with effect from July 2018, as a member of the deal screening task team within the Asset Allocation Committee, which was established further to enhance the unlisted investment process. I'm also a member of the Portfolio Management Committee, Unlisted Investments, as well as the Portfolio Management Committee of the Listed Investments.
Thank you. I'd like you now to explain to the Commission the concept fund of funds.
So, in line with client mandates, Fund of Funds team was established by the PIC to establish, specifically to implement indirect investments of the PIC as required by mandates from clients. Therefore, Fund of Funds is responsible for all indirect unlisted investments. So Fund of Funds' primary role is to source and invest in third-party private equity funds. The Fund of Fund proposition allows the PIC to do the following: extend the reach of its investment strategy, not only in financial services sector, but in the underlying industries in which the various investments are made. Diversify its portfolio across geography, sector, asset class, as well as vintage. Contribute to the transformation of the financial services industry, specifically private equity, through allocation of capital predominantly to black-owned management funds.
What is still not clear, these fund of funds, are these surplus funds?
So to explain it by way of examples, some of you might know of private equity firms like Ethos, Sphere, and so forth, right? So we would allocate capital to some of these funds to do investments on our behalf as well. And that achieves a number of objectives, as I stated earlier on. One of which is to further diversify our portfolio. And secondly, some of these funds tend to be a lot more nimble sometimes than we are. And therefore, the rate of investment can be a bit quicker than we are able to achieve. And furthermore, it is a mechanism of also transforming the private equity space from our perspective, in the sense that we tend to allocate a lot more to black fund managers than the historically advantaged private equity firms. So it is a way of diversifying our portfolio even further to generate a bit more returns as well, and to make the portfolio a lot more robust. So effectively, that's how we invest in the fund of funds space. It's basically a fund of various funds. That's basically all it really means.
Question? Yeah, a question. So in terms of those funds of funds, how many funds of funds are you supporting, roughly the number? And then what is the capital, the committed amount on those particular funds? And the third question, are they in private equity only, or they could be in like infrastructure and other areas?
To your first question, it's about 23 funds that we've invested in. The total amount is just shy of 10 billion rands. And it's largely generalist funds. In other words, they invested in a number of sectors at the moment, yeah. Yeah.
Generalist, private equity,
Exactly.
typical funds?
Yes, that's correct.
Not specialist funds?
Not at the moment. We are looking at specialist funds, though.
Okay.
Given the work that you do, and notwithstanding the rules and guidelines of the PIC, are you aware of any of PIC staff, directors, or associates who have been involved in placing their own funds or funds that they have as part of these investments? Even if whether or not the rules allow it is a separate question, but are you aware of anyone to your knowledge who has participated as individuals as part of these investments in any of the 23 funds?
To the best of my knowledge, no, ma'am.
Can you also confirm that the funds project, it falls within your mandate from your 3 top clients?
It falls within the mandate of the main client, the largest client being the GPF.
And as I understand the concept, where you invest these funds in these other firms, you are the principal, providing the funds to these funds.
Yes, so the PIC will be what we call a limited liability partner,
Yes.
right? And the funds will be what, in the terminology we call the general partners. So to the extent that we get a proposal, the proposal will go through the exact same process as stipulated earlier on by Mr. Raja. There are small nuances, and those nuances are the following. So, in as far as the desktop assessment is concerned, the application based on desktop evaluation means if it meets the mandate requirements, a pre-DD questionnaire is sent to the client for completion. The purpose of the pre-DD, of the pre-due diligence phase, is make initial assessment of the quality of the client. Some of the factors that we consider would include the experience of management, investment process, portfolio management capability, technology, as well as resources that that fund manager has. The client's response to these pre-DD questionnaires is then evaluated, and the deal team will use a scoring matrix that is completed by the deal team to come up with the final score as to whether or not to proceed further. Each transaction must have a pre-due diligence score of at least 3.5 out of 5 to proceed to the next phase of the investment process. That's the one key slight difference between ourselves and the process that, the unlisted approval process. In as far as the deal approval is concerned, the relevant deal approving committee for fund of funds transactions above the delegation of authority for PMC is the investment committee. So that's it.
Can you also confirm, as your colleague, you've been with the PIC for a brief period, but in that period, to your personal knowledge, and you've read about the media reports of 2017 and 18 about alleged contravention of legislation, policies, contractual obligations, etc. Do you know of any such improprieties?
No, sir.
Do you know of any director or employee that used his or her position or privileges or confidential information for personal gain or to improperly benefit another person?
No, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, that concludes the evidence of this witness.
Just a quick question. Of the 23 funds that you support, and in one section you say you want to boost black fund managers, what would be the black component within those 23 funds?
So you mean across all of them, how many of them are black fund managers? If I briefly scan through all of them, I think the majority, over 50% of these fund managers are black fund managers. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. That concludes the business of the day then. I just want to make sure the initial planning was to start at 9 a.m. in the morning. It seems difficult to do that. Are you comfortable that we start rather at 10?
Yes, I think we believe that it is more convenient to start at 10, considering traveling and so on. Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
So
Commissioner.
the hearing will then adjourn until tomorrow morning at 10.
Thank you.
Thank you. Adjourn.
Can I ask you to give this to the commissioners? Adabu, Pumwani, and Adabu. Okay. You happy to start at 10? You need it, right? Can you also ask
You see that that is waste. Yeah.
to
That's
come
what they
if
do now. When it
possible?
is his glasses, we're going to throw it out. These ones, we can't throw them out.
Well done. Thank you. Well done. Wasn't that difficult, was it?
Hold, hold.
I think it was a walk in the park.